Nanking, China, represents a chapter in history marked by tragedy, resilience, and the indomitable spirit of humanity. It's December 1937. Every building in sight is ransacked or burning. Bodies litter the streets, and the accounts of sexual violence grow every day. Sure, this is war, and sure, this was the consequence of conflict. But had the Japanese military gone beyond the pale? We mine into one of World War II's most shocking events, a cause of international outrage and a terminal wound in Sino-Japanese relations. Following the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army would reach the capital Nanking and unleashed violations on a scale never seen. The Japanese military's conduct at Nanking has been widely condemned, violating many principles of international law and human consideration, from the murder of the defenseless to mass sexual violence. Come with us as we explore the ways the Japanese military went too far. In July of 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War would begin with the Marco Polo incident. Among many, this stands as a stark example of how little is needed for tension to escalate to full-blown warfare. Following its 1931 invasion of Manchuria, Imperial Japanese forces made several incursions along the vital Marco Polo Bridge, a railway line from Tianjin's port to Beijing. However, on July 7, 1937, the absence of one Japanese soldier from his unit would change the course of history. Quite astoundingly, it was a stomachache of Private Shimura Kikujiru that led to Japanese and Chinese forces opening fire on one another that opened the doors of war. On a more tragic note, Shimura returned to his unit shortly after the gunfire had begun, but by that point, it was all too late. Japanese forces would then begin advancing through the Chinese mainland rapidly, securing profound victories including the capture of Beijing and Shanghai. The worst was ahead. The worst was some 6 months later, when the Japanese forces arrived at the capital of Nanking. Once Shanghai had been taken by Japanese forces, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek understood that the fall of Nanjing was an inevitability. While the Japanese forces faced fierce resistance, even in the form of hand-to-hand combat in the streets, Shanghai had been overwhelmed by a relentless aerial and naval onslaught. By December 1st, the Chinese government had left Nanking to relocate, and the army's forces saw the capital as an indefensible position. They soon withdrew en masse. The only forces that could stop an impending Japanese demolition were nowhere to be found, as the city outskirts were surrounded. On the 9th of December, Japanese forces dropped leaflets into the city demanding a surrender within 24 hours, assuring no mercy would be shown if they chose otherwise. The wealthiest citizens fled in automobiles. The middle classes soon followed, and the only ones left behind were the poorest citizens, defenseless, and without the means to leave. In a matter of days, one of the worst abominations of World War II would unravel. On the 13th of December 1937, Japanese forces reached the city of Nanking and were met with barely any resistance. What would envelop into a 6-week-long massacre started on the very day of their arrival. In truth, the abandoned capital fell to Japanese forces before they stepped foot into the city. Japanese forces were entirely unchecked, and the brutality was off the page. There are contested claims to this day that a contest ran between officers to see who could kill 100 people with a sword before even reaching Nanking. What is not contested is that commanders in the Japanese forces allowed looting and sexual violence before they even reached the capital. While the massacre would go on for 6 long weeks, it is understood the first 3 weeks were the worst. Just 2 days in diary accounts from refugee survivors describe looting, the destruction of schools, the murder of innocents, and widespread sexual violence. This was the landscape of what would be half the citizens of Nanking day in, day out for weeks. There was only one island of potential refuge, and it was not actually set up for the native population. In a remarkable beacon of humanitarian aid amid chaos, a safety zone was established within Nanking. Thanks to the wonky geopolitics of the era, the Nanking Safety Zone was headed by John Raab, a German businessman and established member of the Nazi Party. Therefore, the safety zone was out of bounds for the Japanese troops thanks to the pact between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. The safety zone was some 5 kilometers squared in size, made up of a series of refugee camps. Ironically, the zone was, in its design, set up for Western foreigners in Nanking at the time, though estimates state not much more than 30 Westerners were in the camps when atrocity arrived. It did perform remarkably well at protecting people from death and violence, though, with an astonishing 250,000 Chinese civilians harbored from danger. That isn't to say the safety zone was entirely safe. Many Japanese soldiers took no respect for the zone. John Robb did his best to appeal to the Japanese Army on several occasions, but this was not enough. Across the 6-week ordeal, Japanese soldiers would enter the zone and abscond hundreds of men and women, only to murder and/or commit sexual violence upon them. As for reasoning, Japanese soldiers would claim those in the zone were guerrillas, out of uniform, or Chinese soldiers that had snuck in. This meant routinely that people were misidentified and innocents were killed. Ultimately, across the 6 weeks, the safety zone did not guarantee safety. The extent of mass murder during the Nanking massacre is hard to understand and even harder to imagine. Accounts from the time attest that the hospital at the University of Nanking was overflowing its capacity of gunshot wound victims from the entire duration of the ordeal. John Robb would write in his diary that dead bodies could be seen every 100 to 200 yards, commonly with bullet holes in their backs. These were innocent people running away. Unquestionably, this was a systemic massacre in its most unflinching, barbaric form. Some estimates say tens of thousands were killed. Other estimates say over 300,000 were killed by Japanese forces. These were all unarmed soldiers or innocent civilians unable to leave. Accounts that detail the murders graphically speak of bayoneting and beheading. No one was spared, including the elderly. Murder and execution of civilians were done without orders, sporadically by individual actors on their own whim. In Nanking, there was a 10,000 corpse ditch established from these atrocities. Yet, thanks to the chaos of this episode, the exact number of victims can never be known. Along with the murder and denigration of the general public of Nanking, the city itself was ravaged by Japanese soldiers. Looting of homes and properties began in the opening days of the forces arriving and did not stop across the weeks ahead. Described as roving bands of soldiers who would enter every building in the city multiple times, and they would take whatever they pleased, often in the sight of their commanding officers. Humiliatingly, these Japanese soldiers sometimes demanded that Chinese citizens carry their stolen goods. Yet, having ransacked countless houses and buildings, leaving many homeless, the worst was yet to come: the arson of the city. After the first week of atrocity, the burning of the city began. An entire third of the city was destroyed thanks to arson. It was not discriminatory in any form. Personal homes were burned to the ground, newly built government buildings alike, as well as property between the city walls. Eyewitness accounts state the burning went on for weeks in a city defenseless to stop it. The most horrifying aspect of the massacre at Nanking, as it for a long time was named after, was the shocking abundance of sexual violence. A systemic operation of Japanese soldiers going from door to door in search of women to be captured and denigrated sexually. Some estimates have the number of women wronged at 20,000, while other estimates place it as high as 80,000. Chillingly, accounts of those present in the safety zone recurringly claim they believe 1,000 women were subject to sexual violence every night. Beyond this, there are accounts of coercion by Japanese soldiers forcing incestuous acts between Chinese civilians. Women wronged in this way were almost always murdered afterwards. Those who intervened and tried to stop the sexual violence had their lives taken too. The sexual violence in Nanking remains one of the worst elements of the ordeal that may never be reconciled, and stands as a point of tension between the nations to this very day. Life after the atrocity has proven complicated and tangled for both the nation wronged and the nation guilty of perpetuation. There would be military tribunals held for the Japanese war criminals. Some 7 Imperial Japanese Army higher-ups were convicted and sentenced to hanging in the late 40s, and several more were tried and convicted across other tribunals. Yet, wounds felt on a national level have left national stains. Right-wing nationalists in Japan have stoked severe controversy with denial of the event's extent or even existence. Even a 1995 formal apology from Japanese Prime Minister Murayama was felt lacking by many in China. In the years since, Denials have consistently upheld this point of unresolved tension in Sino-Japanese relations. Full accountability is lacking, and full healing is yet to be found. One can only hope heart can be found, wrongs can be recognized, and the sins of our forebearers can be left as their own. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.